So we need some JavaScript. So let's add in our script tag. So we're going to say script source equals, and you can really call this whatever you want, quiz.js, app.js. I'm just going to call it app.js. It's pretty straightforward. We're making a web app, so we'll just call our JavaScript file app. And so then I'm going to make a new file and save this as app.js. And I'm going to go to my 2-tab view for a bit just to kind of go over how JavaScript actually works when we're working with the document object model. This is basically our quiz over here in the HTML, right? I'm going to hide the sidebar for a moment just so it's easier to see that. That's our document. And what the document object model is it's like basically an idea inside of JavaScript which outlines what we have in our document so that we can play with or reference things in the page. So if I go over to my console and I type in document, you can see it has like a little copy of the document with references to the different parts. So here's the body section, there's the container, there's the header and the interface and the quiz. There's the quiz question container and the question and the answers and each option for the answer. So it's this nice little, hierarchical tree structure. And in JavaScript, if we want to do something with our HTML, we can say stuff like document.write hello world. That's actually going to rewrite the whole document, which obviously isn't that useful, but that's just kind of your basic example. So we can use JavaScript to change what we see in the document. We can also change the style. So I can say something like document.body.style let's say color equals green, and now we have green text. So our JavaScript can use the document object model to interact with our HTML elements, and then through the HTML elements with our CSS styles. So we can kind of connect everything together. We have to do two things with our JavaScript, and we're just going to get started on this. One is we have to know when the user has done certain things, like click the Start Quiz button or clicked on one of our options. The other thing we have to do is we have to add or change HTML content in order to represent to the user what their clicks or what their interactions have done to the document. The way that we do that to get started is by creating references to our HTML in JavaScript, and then we use events to listen for specific user interactions like clicking or typing. Really, the very first thing that we want to be able to do is we want to be able to detect if the user's clicked a button. And if they have, we want to give them some information. To start, we're going to get some references to some parts of our HTML. So we're going to start with our Start Quiz button. And the way we get a reference to the HTML is using something called document.getElementById. This is a method that's part of the document object model. So if I say document get element by ID, I can get a specific element on the page. So if I get the start button, it references the actual start button right there. And what I want to do is I want to save that start button as a variable so I can reference it as many times as I want. So I'm going to make a variable called start button, and I'm going to use a variable declaration that you may not have seen before, which is const. I'm going to make this a bit bigger. So const is kind of like var, which we've seen before, or let, but const is for variables that are never going to be changed. So since like my start button is never going to go away or be moved to a different button, or I'm not going to like change the position value like I would with like, variable X and variable Y. Since I'm not planning on doing any of those things, I can use const here to indicate that this is a variable that's never going to be changed to anything else. So I'm going to say constant start button, and I'm going to assign it to document.getElementById and start. Okay, so this ID here has to match the ID that I have in my HTML. If this was, start dash button, then I'd have to call this start dash button. This is basically just a string that the HTML document object model uses to find an element with this ID. So it's actually pretty straightforward. It just looks really long because JavaScript tends to use very what's called verbose or very long method names. So get element by ID is very specific in terms of like what it does. It gets an HTML element, right? One of these guys using its ID. So it looks through all these IDs and it finds the one that matches the string that we put here. So that's what goes into this argument here. The name of the variable really doesn't matter. It doesn't have to match this. It often will match it just because, if I want to know what this is, I'm going to call it the start button, right? But it doesn't have to. The variable just has to match itself inside the JavaScript page. The ID is what connects this JavaScript variable to my HTML. Okay, so now I want to know if the user has clicked the start button. So these are my HTML references up here. So I'm going to have a couple more in a moment. Let's also just put in a little comment here, just so we know where we are. So this is our quiz web app. So we're going to start with the start button, and we just want to know if the user clicked it. So this is where we're going to add our events. So we're going to have mostly just a couple of click events for now. So I'm going to say start button. And so here's where we're going to get into a new concept. So start button.add event listener. This is a way that I add an event listener to an HTML element. This probably sounds really crazy because these words are really long, but essentially all this is doing is it's adding a special piece of code inside of our JavaScript that's just like listening over and over and over again to see, did I click start? Did I click start? Did I click start? Did I click start? As long as I didn't click start, it doesn't care. But when I do click start, that's when. So first we have to tell it what kind of event we're looking for. We're looking for a click event. And then what we put in the next argument for our event listener is a function. This is called a callback function. So let me put that down here. We're going to write a callback function in a moment. When we click the start button, we're going to want to start our quiz, but because of the way I'm going to design this, I'm basically just going to load the next question. So I'm going to call this load next question. And that's just the name of the function. So our callback function just goes into the argument here. It's called a callback function because it's not going to happen right away. It's going to happen when this event occurs. So, when this event occurs, we're going to call this function that we've already defined at the beginning of our program. So to create that callback function, I'm going to say function load next question. And for now, I'm just going to use this as, building some HTML. But in the next video, we're going to kind of break out our components a little bit. We're sort of going to pretend that this doesn't exist and that what we have to do with the JavaScript is actually create this. But I'm going to leave it here for the moment so that I can look at how it looks and then create it in JavaScript. All of these divs and stuff, we can actually make these. The way that we do that is using a different method in the document. We can say document.createElement. And you can create, whatever kind of element you want. If I want to create a paragraph, now I have a paragraph. It's not on the page because I didn't add it yet, but I can add it. I can say document.body.append child. I know these are very long words. Append child just means add this element to, whatever other elements. So the body is the body element, and we're going to append this child. So we're going to append, let's assign this to a variable first. So variable P is document.createElement P. And then we'll say document.body.append child, and we'll append that P. You still don't see anything because there's no content, but I can add some content. I can say p.textContent equals hello world. And now you can see it on the page. So we can actually use JavaScript to create HTML. And you might be saying, why don't I just write out some HTML? The thing that is nice about this is that we can add all of our quiz questions one at a time using JavaScript. And that makes it a lot easier, as we'll see as we go through these videos, to change the JavaScript to make a lot of different quizzes with different questions, or change simple things about the quiz without having to hunt through a ton of HTML. So let's build our quiz question. First, we need to create our main container. And HTML is a little annoying because we do have to put one thing inside of another. We can't just throw things in random places. So we do have to start with this container. So to create the div for that container, let's make a variable. So we'll call this This is again going to be a constant because we're not going to reassign any of these variables. So we'll say constant question container. And this obviously looks different than this. This is just a convention, and there are different conventions. Different people have different rules for this. What I've always done is that for HTML and CSS, we use all lowercase letters and we use dashes when there's 2 words. JavaScript, we always use a lowercase at the beginning and then a capital letter for the second word rather than a dash. So even though I'm using the same 2 words, the naming convention is different. One reason for that is I can't use dash as a variable, as a name in JavaScript, because obviously it has a meaning. It means minus. So in JavaScript, if I try to say like variable question dash container, it's going to think that I'm trying to do subtraction. So let's say, this is not going to work. See, it's going to say unexpected token dash. So instead I use question container. So we're going to create an element here. Rather than assigning it to an element that already exists, we're going to create a completely new element. Document.createElement, and then I'm going to create a div. Okay, so the name of the element that we want goes in here. So that's obviously div. So we put div in here. So then I need to add the class, right? This guy. So the way that we do that in JavaScript is we take our element, question container, and then we use something called the class list, because an element can have multiple classes, right? And so we add to the class list. So we say .add, and we want to add the class question dash container. Okay, so then you're probably saying, why did I have double quotation marks and single quotation marks? It doesn't really matter. For whatever reason, I've always used double quotation marks for HTML, and I've always used single quotation marks for JavaScript. Again, there's probably people who would argue one way or another. It's good to be consistent, but beyond that, it doesn't make a big difference, except in cases where you have like some quotation marks inside of your strings. Anyway, this is good enough for now. And so then I've got my container, and I just have to add it to my quiz. So obviously to do that, I need a reference to my quiz. So we're going to add that up here in our main HTML references. We're going to say constant quiz. And I probably don't want to just call this quiz, because I'm sure I'll want to call other things quiz. So I'm going to call this quiz container, because it does contain the quiz. Say document.getElementById quiz. And so now we can say quiz container.append child, and we're just going to add the question container. Okay, I know this sounds nuts, but it does eventually make a lot of sense. If I click that start button, this function should run, and we should get this new question container. So I'm going to click the start button, and there we go. You see that question container. There's nothing in it, so we don't see anything on the page right now, but you do see that it's in the HTML. So at this point, you're probably thinking, this is insane. Why did I do all of that just to add some HTML that I could have copied and pasted? Well, the nice thing about this is that you can do this as many times as you want just by clicking the start button over and over. That's not what we're going to do, but you can create tons and tons of HTML using JavaScript rather than physically copying and pasting it. So the nice thing about this function is that it's reusable. Every time I click start, you can say it adds a new question container. And as we add more stuff to our program, those questions are going to have different questions and different answers. So ultimately down the road, it's going to lead to a system where we can build a quiz very easily. So we got our quiz container, our question container. Now we need a question. Okay, so we're going to have to repeat a lot of this. So we're going to say constant question equals document.createElement. And this is an H2. And now we need the class. So we're going to say question.classList.add question. So now we add the question to the question container. Question container got added to the quiz container. The question goes inside the question container. It is hard to get the hierarchy right, but it should work. So question container dot append child question. Okay, so let's see what happens now. I'll add a few of those guys. So now we have a few questions. Okay, the question doesn't have any content. So how do we add content? We can say question.textContent equals, and this is going to be a placeholder for now. We'll put this, this will be something we do with code later. But for now, it's just whatever the next question is. What is 2 plus 2? And so now let's take a look at that so we can add a bunch of questions. Okay, not bad. One thing that you probably noticed is that like these lines all look exactly the same, right? It's kind of annoying. So why don't we just create a real quick helper function to make this easier? So what I want to do is instead of having to say createElement div classlist.add and then eventually text, we can add a new function that will do a lot of that work for us. Again, the point of adding functions, the point of writing JavaScript code is that we can reuse code rather than repeating it. So I'm going to create my own createElement function. And so the first thing we need is what the tag is. So let's call that tag name. Then we need to know what class to add. Obviously, we could add multiple classes, but so far we only have one for each, so that should be fine. And then optionally, we might add some text. So now we can do constant element. I'll do elem for element. Document.createElement. So tag name. Okay, so now instead of doing createElement div, createElement h2, I'll just put the tag name as an argument, and then I'll get that down there. And then we'll say elem.classlist.add, the class name. You might add elements that don't have classes, but I actually don't think this would throw an error. We could find out if we ever get to that case. And then finally, we have elem.textContent equals text. And so this question container doesn't have any text, right? It doesn't have a text content part. But I'm pretty sure that if text is undefined, this will not throw an error. Again, we'll see when we try it. So one thing that we do have to add here is we have to return the element back to our variable. So now I can simplify this. So instead of document.createElement, I have createElement div. And then for the second argument, I'll just put in the class here. Okay. I still need to append here. I'm just going to leave that as is. This one is going to get a lot simpler. So again, this is now just createElement instead of document createElement. And for the class name, it's question. And then the text is this text content here. Okay, so now I can get rid of those two lines. And it should be the same. Cool. So yeah, sorry if that was a little confusing, but basically, rather than just repeating all that code over and over again, I'm just going to repeat it here and use a few arguments. So I have like my div, my class, and then my text if it needs it. Okay, almost done. Now I have my answers. So that's another container. So I'm going to say constant answers and say createElement div, and the class is answers. That was a lot faster. And answers are part of the question container. So we say question container dot append child answers. And then the options go inside of the answers. So we'll do a much better version of this when we create our classes later. But for now, I'm just going to copy and paste this. So I'm going to say option 1 equals createElement div option. So div is the tag, option is the class name, text is, let's say 2. That's the answer. And I'm just going to copy and paste that a couple times. We're going to do this in a better way later. And just change like 4 and let's say 8. And then we just have to append those. So answers.append child option 1. So I'm just going to copy that a couple times, 2, 3. Okay, so now we can add tons of questions. Okay, pretty cool. So hopefully you'll start to see why this is useful. Instead of copying and pasting a bunch of HTML, I can add new questions on the fly using JavaScript. And once we add a few more components to this, we'll be able to add JavaScript with different questions and different answers. And we'll also be able to keep track of user input and stuff like that. So now I can delete my HTML from my quiz. And so we'll just leave this as an empty div to fill later. Okay, pretty cool. So one thing that you might be asking is, if I can add HTML from my JavaScript, why bother having any HTML at all? Can't I just, create it all in JavaScript? And that's true. And you might, at some point decide to do that. For some things that don't really need to be related to the JavaScript, or that are always going to be there, like the start button, the next button, this message, things like that aren't really going to change. That's nice to have in HTML because you can keep your JavaScript a little simpler. But it really depends on what is happening with a particular piece of code or content, whether it should go in HTML and JavaScript. There's not always a right answer to making those decisions, but there should be, a logical reason for it. So that's it for this video. I'm just going to quickly add that this is a helper function to create HTML elements, and I'm gonna commit this, and this is just kind of like our beginning project. In the next video, we're actually gonna add a quiz question and add like a little quiz class so that we can begin to have a much more structured program. And then we'll also start to think about, what is the experience of this project over the user's interaction. Well, actually, let's make a link for this first. So I'm just going to take a screenshot of that to use as a thumbnail. And so here's my project, and I have my screenshot on my desktop. So I'm going to drag this over, and I'm going to call this thumbnail.png. Looks good enough, whatever. And then I'll go back to Sublime. I'm gonna just close these guys out and open up index.html. And I'm gonna add a new link after the final version of my snake project. This one, now we have project 2-1, and the PNG is, I called it thumbnail.png. And the href is project 2-1, and this is our quiz project, document object model edition. So just kind of the beginning project. And you know what, why don't we just put this up at the top of the portfolio so that we can see it more easily. So let's go back here. Okay, so now I'm gonna close this out and just make sure to upload this. So I have my new files, my updated link, and my thumbnail. So let's say adds quiz project 2-1 and commit to master and push. All right, so that's it for this video. In the next one, we'll continue working on the quiz and build it out a little bit more so that we can actually, answer questions and stuff like that. So that should be fun. Let me know if you have any questions on Discord or email me, and I'll see you guys in class.